Androcentrism is the practice, conscious or otherwise, of placing male human beings or a masculine point of view at the center of one's worldview and its culture and history. The related adjective is androcentric, while the practice of placing the feminine point of view at the center is gynocentrism. Origin of the term. The term androcentrism has been introduced as an analytic concept by Charlotte Perkins Gilman in the scientific debate. Perkins Gilman described androcentric practices in society and the resulting problems in her investigation on the man-made world, or Our Androcentric Culture, published in 1911. Thus, androcentrism can be understood as a societal fixation on masculinity whereby all things originate. Under androcentrism, masculinity is normative and all things outside of masculinity are defined as other. According to Perkins Gilman, masculine patterns of life and masculine mindsets claimed universality while female ones were considered as deviants. Education. In the past, boys and men were expected to have better formal education than girls and women. Girls and women were less frequently able to read and write than boys and men were. Thus, written material tended to reflect the male point of view. Well into the second half of the 20th century, young men entered university far more frequently than young women. Some universities consciously practiced a numerous clauses and restricted the number of female undergraduates they accepted. Therefore, educated opinion risked being androcentric. Today, women in industrialized countries have far better access to education than men. TV and film. The vast majority of films are written and directed by men. This may result in an androcentric bias, with most films being created from a male perspective. Of the top 250 grossing films in 2007, 82% had no female writers and only 6% had a female director. 70% of all film reviews published in the USA are written by men. Therefore, not only men have more influence than women over the storyline and characters of most films, but also they have the most influence when it comes to publicly reviewing them. Because most film reviewers are male, androcentric films may tend to receive more glowing reviews than female-centric films. A 2009 study conducted by the Gina Davis Institute analyzed 122 children's films and found both a male bias behind the scenes of the films as well as a male bias in the content of the films. Of this sample, 93% of directors, 87% of writers, and 80% of producers were male. Therefore, an androcentric perspective was dominant in most of the films. The report argued that the male dominance behind most of the films was connected to a male bias in the content of the films themselves. For instance, the majority of the speaking characters in these films were also male, and female characters were much more likely than male characters to be portrayed as beautiful. The report argued that cinematic females are valued more than cinematic males for the looks, youthfulness, and sexy demeanor. The arts. In 1985, a group of female artists from New York, the Guerrilla Girls, began to protest the underrepresentation of female artists. According to them, male artists and the male viewpoint continue to dominate the visual art world. In a 1989 poster titled, "Do Women Have to Be Naked to Get Into the Met Museum?" they reported that less than 5% of the artists in the modern art sections of the Met Museum were women, but 85% of the nudes were female. Over 20 years later, women were still underrepresented in the art world. In 2007, Jerry Saltz criticized the Museum of Modern Art for undervaluing work by female artists. Of the 400 works of art he counted in the Museum of Modern Art, only 14 were by women. Saltz also found a significant underrepresentation of female artists in the 6 other art institutions he studied. Generic male language. In literature, the use of masculine language to refer to both men and women may indicate a male or androcentric bias in society where men are seen as the norm, and women as the other. Some examples are forms of address and masculine nouns and pronouns to refer to both men and women. Philosophy scholar Jennifer Saul argued that the use of male generic language marginalizes women in society. In recent years, some writers have started to use more gender-inclusive language. Many Latin-based languages in the world are also male-centric. For instance, in Spanish the word padres means parents, abuelos means grandparents, and chicos means either boys or children. Pluralized nouns are, if describing a mixed gender group, assigned male word endings, pronouns, and adjectives. This dominance of the masculine grammatical form in formation of the plural is a property also of Italian, Portuguese, and French. Many studies have shown that male generic language is not interpreted as truly gender-inclusive. Psychological research has shown that, in comparison to unbiased terms such as he or she and humankind, masculine terms lead to male-biased mental imagery in the mind of both the listener and the communicator. 3 studies by Michael Hamilton show that there is not only a male people bias but also a people male bias. In other words, a masculine bias remains even when people are exposed to only gender-neutral language. In 2 of her studies, half of the participants had male-biased imagery but the rest of the participants displayed no gender bias at all. In her 3rd study, only males showed a masculine bias. Females showed no gender bias. Hamilton asserted that this may be due to the fact that males have grown up being able to think more easily than females of any person as generic he, since he applies to them. Feminist anthropologist Sally Slocum argues that there has been a long-standing male bias in anthropological thought as evidenced by terminology used when referring to society, culture and humankind. According to Slocum, all too often the word man is used in such an ambiguous fashion that it is impossible to decide whether it refers to males or just the human species in general, including both males and females. Generic male symbols. The default images in Western society for man and for human being are usually the same. For example, the walking person light looks the same as the symbol for man on the door of a male restroom. The typical symbol for woman looks quite different. On the Internet, many avatars are gender-neutral. However, when an avatar is human and discernibly gendered, it usually appears to be male. This indicates that the image of a man is considered to be a normative representation of humankind in general. Politics and the law. In 2008, Rwanda became the first country in the world to have a female-majority parliament. As of March 2011, Rwanda remains the only country in the world to have a female-majority parliament. Most parliaments in the world today are made up primarily of men. Therefore, there may be some androcentric bias in lawmaking. As of the 31st of January 2011, the global average of women in parliament is 19%. In the Nordic countries, the proportion of females in parliament is high, about 41% on average, but the representation of women in parliament in many other Western countries is much lower. Christianity. The vast majority of Bibles available today were translated mainly by men. For instance, 93% of the New International Version translators were male and 86% of the NRSV translators were male. Therefore, arguably, many Christian teachings come from a more masculine or androcentric viewpoint, and women's experiences and viewpoints can be marginalized. About half of the Bible translations today use male generic words exclusively in gender-inclusive context, arguably marginalizing women. Some of the more recent translations of the Bible have tried to use gender-accurate language where appropriate in the context. The 1989 New Revised Standard Version (NRSV) and the 2005 Today's New International Version (TNIV) are examples. All of the known authors of the Bible are male. Most well-known biblical characters are men, and women make up only 14% of named characters in the Bible. Therefore, the Bible is largely written from a male perspective, and the experiences of women in the Bible are interpreted by men. Sports media channels such as ESPN and Fox Sports, as well as sports magazines like Sports Illustrated, are assumed to appeal to a predominantly male audience. This is reflected by its advertisers, who almost exclusively target men. Men are also most likely to stimulate the sporting economy, whether the advertising is targeted non-gender specifically.